Snow fell like sifted flour across the town of Bitter Creek, veiling its mud and shame beneath a white that lied about purity. Inside the lantern-lit tavern, heat trembled above the stew pots where Louisa May Carter worked, her sleeves rolled to the elbows, her hands red from the wash basin. The smell of beans, salt pork, and cornbread clung to her hair. Men filled the room, ranch hands, drifters, the sheriff, each shaking snow from their hats, each loud enough to drown their own loneliness. Louisa moved between them with her ladle and her quiet. She had learned long ago that silence drew less laughter than words. Still, the laughter came. "Ain't pretty," one cowhand said, raising his tin cup. "But she can sure keep a man fed." The others chuckled, the kind of laughter that stings harder for being casual. Louisa smiled the way one does when smiling hurts less than showing it did. "More stew, Emmett?" she asked, her voice gentle, worn smooth by years of swallowing pride. Emmett Pike leaned back in his chair, boots crossed, spurs clinking. "Sure, darlin'. Maybe you can add a pinch of beauty in it this time." His friends laughed again. Martha Bell, the tavern keeper, gave Louisa a pitying glance from behind the counter but said nothing. In Bitter Creek, kindness often hid behind silence. Louisa poured the stew without trembling. She told herself she didn't care what men thought of her. Yet every cruel word found the small, still girl inside her, who once dreamed of being chosen. The wind pressed against the windows, howling like something searching for a way in. Then the door opened. A wall of snow rushed in first, then a figure stepped through, a man taller than the doorway, broad as the oxen that hauled lumber. His skin was weathered bronze, his hair long and white as frost, braided and streaked with wind. Bare chest beneath a fur cloak, beads hanging from his neck. His presence silenced the room. Someone muttered, "Apache." The man's eyes moved slowly across the tavern. Gray, distant, unreadable. He took a single step forward, snow melting off his shoulders. No one spoke. The sheriff's hand brushed his holster, but did not draw. The stranger walked to the hearth, knelt, and held his palms toward the fire. Louisa felt her breath hitch. She'd heard stories, ghosts of warriors who roamed the hills, remnants of tribes scattered by the army. She didn't know whether to fear or pity him. But when he lifted his head, his eyes met hers, and something quiet passed between them. Two people long accustomed to being watched, never seen. Martha whispered, "Louisa, don't." But Louisa was already ladling stew into a bowl. She approached slowly, the wooden floor creaking under her boots. The heat of the fire made her cheeks flush as she knelt beside him. "You hungry?" she asked softly. He didn't answer. His gaze flicked to the bowl, then to her face. His hand, large, scarred, trembling faintly from cold, took it. He ate in silence. Louisa watched the way steam rose against the strands of his white hair, how snowflakes melted and slid down his shoulders. Across the room, Emmett snorted. "Feed in the savage now, Louisa? You plannin' to marry him too?" The laughter was sharper this time, cutting through the low murmur of the fire. Louisa stood, her jaw tight. "Leave him be," she said. Emmett smirked. "Didn't know you took orders from an Indian." The bowl cracked in the giant's hand, just a hairline fracture, but the sound stopped every breath in the room. He rose, towering, eyes burning like coals pulled from the flame. No weapon. No words. Only the kind of silence that feels heavier than thunder. Emmett's smirk faltered. His chair scraped back an inch. The man reached into a small pouch, drew out a silver coin, tarnished but clean, and set it on the counter beside Martha. Then he walked to the door. When he opened it, the wind cried again, scattering ash from the hearth. He stepped out into the storm and vanished as though the snow had swallowed him. For a long moment, no one spoke. Martha exhaled. "Lord help us, girl, don't you ever invite trouble." Louisa stared at the coin. He paid. Paid sure. But his kind always come back for more. Louisa wanted to argue, but the words knotted in her throat. She returned to her stew pot, though her hands felt suddenly unsteady. The fire hissed as snow slipped through a crack in the chimney. The men went back to their drinking, voices low now, glancing at the door as if afraid he might reappear. By closing time, the storm had thickened. Louisa wrapped her shawl tight and stepped into the night. The cold bit at her lungs. Snow clung to her lashes. The town lights blurred behind her, swallowed by distance. Her cabin stood on the edge of the creek, a single yellow glow in the white. Inside, she fed the stove and set down her basket. Her hands still smelled faintly of cedar and iron from where his fingers had brushed hers. She sat by the window, staring into the storm. The wind moaned through the eaves. Out there, beyond the frozen creek, something moved, slow, deliberate. A horse's silhouette, dark against the white. She pressed her face to the glass. The rider halted by the riverbank. The shape was unmistakable. Broad shoulders, hair shining like snow in moonlight. He wasn't moving toward town, nor away, just standing, as if keeping watch. Louisa's breath fogged the window. A strange comfort stirred in her chest, half fear, half warmth. No one had ever stood guard over her life. Not a man, not even luck. She whispered into the quiet. "I ain't pretty, but I can cook." The words trembled, half defense, half confession. The horse shifted. For a moment, she thought he turned his head toward her light. Then the wind rose, and he disappeared behind the curtain of falling snow. Louisa stayed by the window long after the fire dimmed. The storm's rhythm lulled her, steady, endless. Outside, somewhere in that sea of white, rode a man who said nothing, but had looked at her, as though she were not invisible. Inside, she felt a flicker of something she could not yet name, something that burned quietly, like hope disguised as fear. The last ember in the stove popped. She rose to stir it, and the red glow lit the corner of her room where she'd left her apron hanging. On it, faint but visible, was the print of his thumb, darker against the flour, shaped like a promise she didn't yet understand. Louisa touched it lightly, her heart knocking once, twice, then settling into the hush. Snow whispered against the windows, soft as breath. Outside, unseen, a wolf howled, low and distant, and she felt without reason that it was meant for her. The night held its breath. The storm broke 2 days later, leaving the world buried and hushed beneath drifts that shone like glass. Louisa woke to find her door half blocked by snow, and her heart strangely restless. She dreamt of the white-haired Apache standing by the river, unmoving as the storm swallowed him whole. The dream had lingered like the scent of wood smoke, heavy, real, and impossible to forget. She bundled herself in her thick shawl and set to kneading bread, the way her mother once taught her. Fists strong, movements certain. "Work feeds the soul," her mother used to say. But that morning, the dough felt like silence under her palms. Outside, the wind had gone, and all that remained was stillness, a kind that made her listen for something she could not name. By mid-morning, she noticed the tracks. Hoofprints, deep and deliberate, crossed the edge of her garden, circling the cabin once before fading toward the hills. Something small and carved lay half-buried near her step. A wooden wolf, no longer than her thumb, polished smooth with age. She brushed the snow from it and stared. It was crudely made, yet the eyes seemed alive, watching her. That afternoon, she followed the tracks beyond the creek. The snow crunched beneath her boots, the world silent except for her breath. The trail led to the old trading post, long abandoned, roof half collapsed, windows black with soot. Smoke curled faintly from the chimney. Her heart quickened. She pushed open the door and found him there. The white-haired Apache sat by the fire, his shoulder bare and bleeding through a rough bandage. The air smelled of pine pitch and iron. He didn't move when she entered, though his gaze flicked toward her like the slow turning of the moon. "You're hurt," she whispered. He said nothing. She stepped closer, clutching her bread basket like a shield. "You shouldn't be alone." Still nothing. So she placed the loaf beside him, warm and golden, steam rising faintly. He looked at it as though she had set a star at his feet. After a moment, he reached for it, slow, careful, reverent. He tore a piece and ate, his hands shaking. She noticed how his fingers, though large and scarred, touched the bread gently, as though afraid to break it. "Why you follow?" His voice came at last, deep and rough, like gravel turning under water. She hesitated. "You left this by my door." She held out the carved wolf. He looked at it, then at her. "Not leave. Lost." She smiled faintly. Then it found me instead. For the first time his lips curved. Not quite a smile, but near enough. He said something low in Apache, words soft as wind through reeds. She didn't understand, but she felt the weight of it settle around them, heavy with meaning. She knelt, pulled a cloth from her basket, and reached for his wounded shoulder. "Let me see." He tensed but did not stop her. She unwrapped the bandage, her fingers brushing his skin. Hot, hard, trembling beneath. The wound was old, reopened by travel. She cleaned it as best she could, biting her lip against the closeness. His breath deepened, steady and patient, as though he were allowing her this one mercy. When she finished, he murmured, "Why feed the hunted?" She met his gaze. "Because hungry's no sin." The fire cracked, throwing orange across his face. The lines there told stories she couldn't read. Grief, exile, the weight of survival. Her hands smelled of bread and blood now, a scent both human and holy. He watched her in silence. At last he said, "You are not like them." "Like who?" "The ones who stare, but never see." She looked away, flustered. "I suppose we both know what that's like." He turned back to the fire. "They call me Old Wolf." "Louisa," she said quietly. "Louisa May Carter." "Louisa." He repeated it with care, each syllable shaped like a secret. She lingered longer than she meant to, afraid that leaving would break whatever fragile peace had formed in that room. When she finally rose, the sun was sinking, painting the snow through the cracked roof in soft gold. He stood, unsteady but proud, and offered her the wooden wolf again. "For you," he said. "I can't." He pressed it into her palm. "Now you keep it." Their fingers brushed again, a spark, then retreat. She turned and left before her voice could betray her. Outside, dusk had deepened. Smoke rose behind her like memory. That night as she walked back, she saw children sledding down the far hill, their laughter thin and cold. Behind her, the trading post vanished into shadow. By morning, Bitter Creek was buzzing. Martha Bell leaned over the counter, whispering to Sheriff Cole. "She was seen crossin' the creek yesterday, headed toward the ruins. Folks say she's been talkin' to that savage again." Louisa entered then, her cheeks pink from the cold. The room fell quiet. "Bread's fresh," she said simply, setting down her basket. Martha's eyes softened. "Lou, honey, you best be careful. That man's got blood on his hands, I'm sure of it." Louisa looked at her steadily. "So do most men in this town. Only difference is he don't hide it behind a badge or a Bible." The sheriff sighed. "He's dangerous, Louisa. You don't know what he's done." She paused, folding her flower-streaked hands. "I know what he hasn't done. He hasn't laughed at me." The sheriff had no answer. That night the wind returned, though softer this time, bringing the scent of cedar smoke from the hills. Louisa sat by her window, sewing by firelight. The carved wolf rested beside her on the table, its shadow long against the wall. Outside, snow fell again, gentle, endless. She thought of his voice saying her name. She thought of the way he'd looked at her bread as if it were life itself. For years she'd baked for men who never thanked her, only filled their bellies and mocked her face. But that man, that strange broken man, had eaten as though it meant something. She rose and opened her door. The cold rushed in, kissing her cheeks raw. In the distance, faint against the falling snow, a single column of smoke rose from the hills, thin and blue, like a thread stitching two lonely lives together. She watched it until her breath turned to frost. Then she whispered, not knowing if the wind might carry it, "Sleep warm, old wolf." Somewhere far off, a coyote answered, its cry echoing through the frozen creek beds. Louisa smiled through her tears. Behind her, the fire crackled, and the little wooden wolf seemed to shimmer in the glow, its carved eyes catching light as if watching her back. And for the first time in her life, Louisa felt that someone, or something, truly did. By the time March thawed the river's edge, Bitter Creek had found a new way to keep warm, by talking. Louisa's name passed through the town like a secret traded for a smile. They said she walked too far into the hills. They said she baked extra loaves for the Indian ghost. They said no decent woman spent her nights with her lamp burning that late unless someone was watching from the dark. Louisa heard the whispers at the well at the store, even through the cracked door of the tavern kitchen. Martha tried to hush them, but gossip, once loose, rode faster than horses. Louisa learned to keep her head down, to keep her hands busy. She baked bread, split wood, mended seams, each task a small defiance, each silence a prayer for peace. But shame, once lit, burns long. One night she found Old Wolf waiting by the creek. Snow melt shimmered around his boots. He held a bundle of rabbit skins, and a bundle of wood slung across his back. "You should not walk alone," he said. She lifted her chin. "Then walk with me." He nodded once. They crossed the bridge in quiet. The moon burned cold above them, and the scent of pine smoke drifted from her cabin chimney. When they reached the porch, he stacked the wood neatly by her door, then crouched to set the pelts down. "They talk," he said after a while, his voice low. "I know. They call you mine." She turned to face him. "And are you?" His eyes caught the lamplight. "I am what you fed." The words sank into her like a stone into deep water. He turned away before she could answer, vanishing into the trees. Days passed, and the air thickened with spring's thaw, and something meaner. The ranch hands gathered outside the tavern, their voices edged with whiskey and pride. Emmett Pike, bold in front of his crowd, slammed his boot against the rail. "If she's gonna lie down with wolves, we'll drive 'em both out. Sheriff won't do it, we will." Sheriff Cole tried to calm them, but his authority was thinner than the ice on the river. "Ain't no law against kindness," he said, though his eyes were wary. "Leave her be." Emmett spat. "You protectin' her or the savage?" Cole's silence was answer enough. That evening, Louisa stood outside her cabin, the smell of bread mingling with pine. She saw him again, Old Wolf, emerging from the trees with his bow over his shoulder, his steps slow, steady. He nodded toward the loaf cooling on her windowsill. "You still bake for me?" "For you," she said softly, "and for peace." He studied her face. "Peace doesn't live here." She wanted to tell him he was wrong, that she'd found it in the rhythm of his visits, the silent exchanges, the small gestures that made the world less cruel. But the words tangled inside her throat. Instead, she reached for his hand. His skin was rough, warm from the hunt. For the first time, he didn't pull away. Then came the dogs. Their barking shattered the quiet, echoing through the trees. Men's voices followed, rough and drunken. Louisa froze. Old Wolf's head snapped toward the noise, every muscle in his body coiled. "Stay inside," he said. "No," she gripped his arm. "They're coming for you." His eyes softened. "Then they'll find me." She ran to her door, grabbed the rifle that hung above it, and turned back just as torches flared through the forest. The light flickered across the snow, across angry faces. Emmett at the front, his pistol drawn. "Louisa!" he shouted. "Move aside. We'll finish what the cavalry didn't." Old Wolf stepped forward, unarmed, snow hissing beneath his bare feet. He raised his hands slightly, not in surrender, but in patience. Louisa's heart hammered against her ribs. The wind picked up, scattering sparks from the torches like falling stars. "You'll not touch him," she called out. "Don't be a fool," Emmett sneered. "He's using you." "He's never asked me for a thing," she said, her voice trembling. "Not once." The men hesitated, confused by her steadiness. But fear and pride are twin devils. Neither release their grip easily. Emmett cocked his gun. The shot cracked like a whip. Louisa screamed. Old Wolf staggered, clutching his shoulder as blood darkened the snow. Before she could think, she fired her rifle into the air. The echo thundered off the hills, startling the horses, scattering the men. "Go home," she cried, her voice raw. "Go home before I forget I ever baked for you." They backed away, muttering, their courage dissolving into the storm's edge. Emmett lingered last, his mouth twisted. "You'll regret this, Louisa. He ain't worth dying for." She lowered her rifle slowly. "Neither are you." When they were gone, the silence returned heavier than before. Old Wolf sank to his knees, his breath sharp with pain. Louisa dropped beside him, pressing her hands against the wound. Blood seeped through her fingers, hot and steady. "Hold still," she whispered. "Please." He did not flinch. His gaze stayed on her face, calm even as his body trembled. "You fight like thunder," he said weakly. "And you bleed like rain," she murmured. "Don't speak." She tore a strip from her apron, bound his shoulder tight, her fingers slick with crimson. The world shrank to the sound of her breath and his. The fire inside the cabin burned low, casting trembling shadows on the snow. When she finally eased him against the wall, her eyes were wet, but her hands steady. "Why didn't you run?" she asked. He looked past her, toward the stars breaking through the clouds. "Because you stayed." The simplicity of it undid her. She bowed her head until her forehead touched his, and in that quiet contact, something wordless passed between them. Trust, perhaps, or the beginning of something even more dangerous. The wind softened, carrying the smell of gunpowder and pine. Louisa glanced at her cabin window. Her bread had burned. Smoke curled upward, slow and black, smudging the stars. She let it burn. In the distance, the town's church bell rang once, hollow and far. She wondered if they rang it for her shame or his sin. Old Wolf's eyes fluttered, heavy with exhaustion. She whispered, "You'll not die here." He smiled faintly. "Death doesn't follow bread." She didn't know if that was truth or poetry, but she clung to it anyway. She stayed awake beside him through the night, listening to the snow melt in slow rivulets beneath their feet. The sound was soft, like the earth forgiving its own violence. When dawn came, pale and trembling, she opened the cabin door to fetch water. The snow reflected the sunrise in shades of rose and gold. Behind her he stirred and whispered something in his language, low, reverent, almost like a prayer. She turned. "What did you say?" He looked at her through half-closed eyes. "I said the wolf has found his fire." Her throat tightened. She wanted to ask if he meant her, but she couldn't bring herself to speak. Instead, she reached for the wooden wolf on the shelf, set it beside him and whispered, "Then don't lose it again." Outside, the thawing creek began to roar, wild and alive, as if answering. Louisa stood in the doorway, the rifle still warm in her hand, and realized there was no turning back now. Not for her, not for him. Somewhere down in town, men were already talking again. The snow returned without warning, a slow and steady fall that wrapped the valley in silence. Louisa woke before dawn, the air thick and cold, her breath a pale ribbon in the half-dark cabin. The fire had died sometime in the night. Beside it, Old Wolf slept fitfully, his brow damp, his breath shallow. The wound had closed but not healed. His skin was hot beneath her hand, his body trembling like a fevered animal. She fed the fire with the last of the wood, then knelt beside him, pressing a wet cloth to his forehead. "You stay with me now," she whispered. He stirred but didn't open his eyes. All day she worked, hauling wood from beneath the drift, melting snow for water, boiling roots and herbs into bitter tea. Her hands were raw and cracked, her back stiff, but she didn't stop. Sometimes he murmured in Apache, soft and low, and though she couldn't understand, she answered anyway, because silence was the cruelest thing in this world, and she refused to let it take him. By nightfall, the storm was a wall of white beyond her window, so thick it felt like the world itself had vanished. Louisa sat beside him, sewing by the dim light of a single candle. The tiny wooden wolf rested near her, watching. Every so often, the wind rattled the shutters like a ghost asking to come in. Then, faintly, over the howl of the storm, came the sound of hooves. She froze. The rhythm was uneven, men on horseback, voices rising. Her heart lurched. She crossed to the door and peered through a crack in the boards. Torchlight flickered between the trees. "Louisa!" A man's voice called. "The sheriff." "Open up now." She hesitated, then lifted the latch. The door banged open, and cold wind swept through the cabin. Sheriff Cole stepped inside, snow caked on his boots, his face drawn tight. Behind him, two deputies waited, rifles slung over their shoulders. "You're harboring him still," Cole said quietly, his eyes flicking to Old Wolf on the cot. "You know what that means." Louisa straightened. He's no threat to anyone. Cole's jaw flexed. Tell that to the rancher's boy he shot near Devil's Ridge. Her voice softened but did not break. He's not the only man who's ever fired a gun. He just doesn't have a town to lie for him. The sheriff sighed, pulling off his gloves. Lou, I ain't your enemy. But I can't protect you from the rest. They're saying you turned on your own kind. I have no kind, she said. Not anymore. A silence hung between them, heavy and human. The sheriff looked at her, really looked, and something in his eyes faltered. He'd known her since she was a girl, helping her mother at the bakehouse, always polite, always unseen. Finally he said, I'll tell them you're alone here. But when this storm clears, he needs to be gone. You understand? Louisa nodded, though the word gone felt like a blade twisting inside her. Cole turned to leave, pausing at the door. You could leave too, you know. There's a widow in Carson City needs a cook. I can send a letter. Louisa smiled faintly. You think I'm just a cook, Sheriff? He met her gaze for a heartbeat, then shook his head. No. I think you're braver than anyone in this town. And that scares the hell out of them. Then he was gone, swallowed by snow. Louisa shut the door and leaned against it, her breath shaking. She turned to see Old Wolf watching her. His eyes were open now, clear, aware, and unreadable. You heard, she said. He nodded once. You told him no. I told him nothing. You stayed. Louisa sat beside him, exhausted. Maybe I'm the fool they all say I am. He studied her face, then reached out with slow, deliberate care, his fingers brushing the edge of her jaw. No fool keeps fire alive in the storm. The gesture unraveled her. For weeks she had moved like someone waiting for permission to breathe, but here, beneath the sound of the wind and the smell of smoke and pine, she found herself trembling, not from cold, but from something older and deeper. He reached for her hand. Louisa, he said, her name low and reverent, as if he'd been saving it for something sacred. You could have left me. I didn't want to. Why? She looked at him, really looked, at the scars across his chest, the silver threads in his hair, the weight of his eyes that had seen too much. Because when you looked at me, you didn't see what they see. He frowned slightly. What do they see? She smiled, weary and honest. A woman who don't belong anywhere. He reached out, his thumb tracing the faint smudge of flour on her sleeve. Then you belong here. The wind slammed against the door, as though the world itself had heard and disapproved. But Louisa didn't move. When he slept again, she sat awake beside him, the storm pressing against the cabin like a living thing. Her thoughts wandered, of her mother's death, of years working in kitchens that smelled of beer and contempt, of every laugh that had made her smaller. And she realized that for the first time in her life, she didn't feel small at all. At dawn, the snow stopped. The world outside lay buried under a white silence, so deep it felt like the earth was holding its breath. Louisa opened the door, the cold biting her cheeks, and stepped into the stillness. Behind her, she heard him stir, his footsteps soft on the wood. When she turned, Old Wolf was standing in the doorway, wrapped in the blanket she'd sewn, his hair loose, his eyes calm. The wound had stopped bleeding. It's quiet, he said. For now. He walked past her into the light, bare feet sinking into the snow. He looked at the hills, the horizon pale with morning. When I was young, snow meant cleansing. Death first, then life. Louisa joined him. And now? Now it means starting again. She looked toward the town, faint smoke rising far below. They'll come, she said softly. Maybe not today, but soon. Then let them. Old Wolf. He turned to her. I have lived through worse storms than men. The wind tugged at her shawl. She wanted to tell him that storms always leave scars, but before she could, he took her hand, calloused meeting calloused, and held it as though anchoring her to the earth itself. When he spoke again, his voice was almost tender. You should not stand in their fire. They burn what they fear. She met his gaze steadily. Then they'll burn me too. But at least I'll burn warm. Something broke in his face then. Some quiet, hidden restraint. He stepped closer, his breath clouding between them. "You're mine now," he whispered. The words struck her like thunder, soft yet absolute. For a long heartbeat, neither moved. Then she laughed, a small, incredulous sound that cracked through the cold air. "Yours?" she said, almost teasing, though her heart raced. "Since when?" He brushed a lock of hair from her face, his hand lingering at her temple. "Since the day you gave me bread." She felt tears sting her eyes, not sadness, but release. "Then I suppose I've been yours longer than I thought." He smiled faintly, the first true smile she'd ever seen from him. It made him look younger, almost human again. The sound of hooves cut the air. They turned together, seeing shadows on the ridge. 5, maybe 6 riders, torches blazing even in daylight. Emmett and his men. Louisa's hand tightened on Old Wolf's arm. "They'll kill you." He shook his head. "No. They'll try." He reached for her rifle, loaded it, and handed it to her. "You stay inside." "I'm not hiding." He looked at her, and this time there was no command, only understanding. "Then we stand." The riders approached, the snow crunching under hooves, torches trailing smoke. Emmett dismounted first, face red with cold and fury. "You can't save him, Louisa. Step aside." Old Wolf stood tall, the wind whipping his hair. "Go home," he said quietly. "Not till you're in the ground." Louisa raised the rifle, her voice steady. "Then you'll have to put us both there." A long pause stretched, filled only by the hiss of burning pitch. Then Emmett drew his gun. The world narrowed to sound and breath. The crack of gunfire tore through the valley. Snow exploded around them. Old Wolf fired once, clean, precise, and Emmett fell, his torch tumbling into the drift. The others froze. Louisa's heart hammered, but she didn't lower her rifle. "Go," she said, "before the snow takes you too." They turned and fled, horses vanishing into the trees. The torch guttered out, leaving only the smell of smoke and gunpowder. When it was over, she looked at him, his chest heaving, the rifle still in his hands, the stormlight painting his scars gold. She stepped forward, trembling. "You didn't have to." He cut her off gently. "I keep what's mine." She stared at him, the words echoing through her like warmth after hunger. Then she dropped the rifle and pressed her forehead against his chest, the scent of smoke and snow clinging to both of them. For a long while, neither spoke. Outside, the wind softened to a sigh, carrying away the last traces of blood and fire. Later, when the sun broke through the clouds, Louisa stood beside him at the doorway. Below, the world glittered in endless white. He took her hand again, and she let him. "I don't know what tomorrow brings," she whispered. He nodded. "Then we make it ours." And as the sun climbed higher, spilling light across the valley, the snow began to melt, revealing dark soil beneath, proof that even winter must surrender, and that two souls once lost in shame could stand together and call it home. If you listen closely then, past the hush of the wind, past the fading echo of gunfire, you could almost hear it, the soft hum of a woman who once thought herself unworthy, and a man once called savage, finding peace not in words, but in the steady rhythm of a shared heartbeat. And somewhere far above, the sky opened wide, forgiving them both.